And we are live with another episode of Absolute AppSec. This is episode number 15. I'm Ken Johnson, joined by my co-host Seth Law.
Hey, everybody. Welcome once again.
And I once again forgot to mute the video, the live watch page. And we're joined by our special guest tonight, Kevin Cody. Kevin's been on before. Kevin, say hi.
Hey, everybody. How are you doing?
Kevin was Kevin, you were on, and I want to say February. Was it February? I think something like that.
It was much colder.
It was much colder, and basic gist is we had some really good conversations, but one thing we didn't get to was mobile security tooling and tips for testing and things like that. So it's part of what we're gonna cover tonight. But yeah, thanks for joining us, Kevin. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Happy to be here again. You guys probably see me in the chats every week, or I'll watch or listen in the car, on the way to the airport or whatnot. I am a fan, so I'm happy to be back on again.
Yeah, and we definitely appreciate you sharing your knowledge with folks. For those who don't know, Kevin Cody, he's a principal consultant over at Invisium, and as far as people I know that do mobile, he's in the top tier. He's somebody I would definitely ask questions. If you're watching tonight, definitely ask any questions that you have around mobile security to Kevin.
Yeah, you can ask us here if you've got something specific, or you're on Twitter. I think we've already established that, right? But hit him up on Twitter or us on Twitter, and we can point you in the right direction.
Yeah, just a reminder, the email is absoluteappsec@gmail.com. So that's another way you can reach us. So before the show, we were talking about sort of the RSA app and the various mobile vulnerabilities that we've seen publicly. In terms of your testing, Kevin Cody, what are some common things you see in terms of mobile security flaws?
Yeah, I think I'm an OWASP guy, the OWASP Pittsburgh chapter thing here. I think the OWASP mobile testing guide, the OWASP. I don't think they've had an update to the top 10 lately, but the OWASP mobile top 10 from several years ago, I think it does a pretty good job encapsulating some of the issues that we see with mobile. Just brass tacks situation. From a mobile app perspective, we have basically a melding of a web app with a thick client app. So if you've done any testing on thick client apps before, you're going to feel kind of at home as long as you have some understanding of the two primary ecosystems, Android and iOS. If you've done any web application stuff before, 90% of the applications out there use some type of web component, so you'll probably feel comfortable with that. So, basically anything in the OWASP top 10 from the website is going to be applicable. Anything from the obviously the mobile specific stuff from the OWASP testing guides is obviously going to be applicable. It's really, anything you can think of from the web world is applicable to mobile, and anything that you can think of from the thick client world or the mobile specific world, as far as threat actors with wireless radios, on storage of materials locally, that kind of stuff is going to be applicable too.
Cool. So if we dig into just specifics, right? Obviously the data storage aspect is pretty huge, like stolen devices or somebody's compromising a device. But do you have any examples of that, right? Obviously we've been talking about RSA. That was a couple of weeks ago. That was the one that was released on Twitter, where somebody could get all of the attendee information from the backend web service, right? Based on the keys that were in the mobile app. But what else have you seen? What else has been interesting to you in the mobile space that you would call out or would find as an interesting, anecdote, I guess, of the way that a mobile app fails?
Yeah. So when you have a mobile application, the first thing that I like to do is just kind of like a web application, just spider the thing, go through, see what internal calls it's making, if you can hook things internally, or view API calls, or do some dynamic hooking. And also, of course, we're going to view any external traffic to web services, to any other local network traffic or whatnot. So I will be completely honest, I'm not 100% versed in the specific RSA thing. I saw a lot of chatter on it. I specifically didn't click into it just because sometimes ignorance is bliss when it comes to people who are actively looking at stuff out there in the wild. I'll look at the postmortem in a few weeks maybe, but I didn't want to get tempted, to be completely honest. But
well, I mean, I can give you a rundown because I read through the post, right? And it wasn't anything that shocking, to be honest with you. I've done a lot of mobile apps too. We've worked together on them before, and on the tooling. So this is why we wanted to chat about it. But basically, it was a combination of an insecure direct object reference on the back end in the web service, but access to the web service required a key that was hard coded in the application itself, right? And that's from what I can ascertain from the screenshots that they actually posted there, was they were spinning through a whole bunch of numbers and then returning, data, at which they screenshotted, oh, here's a whole bunch of first names from the app itself that was being dumped out from Burp because they had the key that they extracted from the application itself. So it wasn't all that shocking to me that this is the case, but I mean, that was this conference application. I've seen other ones that'll dump out, a full attendee list based on the endpoint that you access. It doesn't seem to be that surprising for a conference application to have this sort of a problem. Have you dug into conference applications before? I mean, I know for me, it's a huge problem when I'm at the conference because I want to see what it's doing, and then all of a sudden, I've sat in talks, and for 2 hours I haven't done anything but poked at an application, right?
That was AWS reInvent 2016.
Yes, 2017. I think we did that, didn't we, Ken?
Yeah.
We were trying to game their little app so we could get more free stuff from Amazon for having more friends or something like that, right?
But it was for science.
For science.
Yes. I have looked into mobile conference apps like Sketch or Cvent or something. I have actually a really nerdy reason why I did it once, and it was simply because you submitted your feedback for the speakers in the mobile app, and I was a speaker, and I wanted to see. I just got 4 point whatever stars or 1 point whatever stars. I'm not trying to gloat. Whatever it was, I wanted to see what that number of people who voted was. I didn't just want to see a decimal number. So I middled the traffic, looked at the JSON response, and could actually see what the average was from the raw data that was coming from the endpoint, and figured out that it was 6 people who voted or whatever. But yeah, so I have looked at mobile applications from conferences, and I think what you've hit on as far as looking at the specific vulnerability from the RSA app is certainly a microcosm of the bigger mobile picture, which is mobile applications are somewhat unique because you have the ability to have local storage, and somewhat secure local storage if you do it right. You can, in iOS, you can use the keychain and have some really strong encryption, hardware-based encryption back to for storing secrets and whatnot. In Android, you can use the TEE, which is basically just a trusted enclave or secure enclave, and you can do some math and utilize trusted execution of that chip to do some crypto operations and mathematically prove the data you have is legit or whatnot. So that's great. And that gives us the ability to store something outside of, say, local storage or session storage, which is certainly not very secure. So, but at the end of the day, if you're going to be interacting with web services, you're going to want to authenticate those web services. If you're going to want to authenticate those web services, you have to keep that authentication token or cookie or something somewhere. And at that point in time, if it's in a SQLite database, if it's in the keychain, if it's in a place in storage that is cryptographically signed or secured, but has to be available at runtime, that's going to be exposed. It inherently has to be sent via HTTPS or whatever protocol you use. And at that point in time, it's ripe for abuse the same way web is, right? So.
Well, and that's the interesting thing with this like two-stage that they took for RSA, right? I mean, number one, they never should have hard-coded that value in the binary itself, right? But even had they stored that in a secure enclave, the fact that it was good to actually enumerate through, right, doesn't mean that it was necessarily protected against that, right? You still would be able to extract that key had you done some of the techniques that we use for intercepting the traffic, running it through a proxy, right? We still would have been able to identify this and actually pull that information back, right? So I guess what I'm saying is that, your perspective on analyzing these sorts of applications, is entirely correct, right? It's this thick client application, but you've got to think about the surfaces, both of the surfaces from a mobile perspective and then also from a web perspective. And if you don't, that's where you have a problem because of the nature of that insecure application. You've got to trust that the user that's holding your mobile application is doing it in a non-malicious manner, or protect against the malicious, the people like us that are actually trying to get into it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a gentleman from, I'm from Pittsburgh. I've dealt with folks from a peer and friend level up through a professional level here at the CERT at CMU. And there's one gentleman who's done several analysis of the different app stores for different hard-coded creds, trust chain issues. Trying to think of a couple other. He basically built a tool which uses VMs and different ways of downloading, dynamically analyzing code as well as statically analyzing code, using ephemeral environments and spitting out basically vulnerabilities by the tens of thousands. And at one point in time, he did drop like 10,000 CVEs at one point in time, which was a fun exercise. But,
so is talk about that a little bit, because I'm really interested to see what was he analyzing mostly the Android stores, or did he actually get into the iOS one as well, or the the App Store from Apple? What was his technique? I mean, if we can find, if we could post this would be great. I mean, for me in the future as it is.
Yeah, specifically the one that I was just referencing, or that I dealt with from a professional level, was Android. So he had a tool from CMU's CERT called Tapioca, and basically it consisted of the not VMware, the open version. Anyway, VirtualBox. Thank you. It consisted of VirtualBox and some different MITM proxies and different things. And basically, it would just spin up these ephemeral VM instances, do both static and dynamic code analysis, and it could basically hook the different applications using the proxies and check for trust chain issues. And that specifically, the one that I interfaced with at a place that I used to work, was a trust chain issue. It was somewhere in the trust chain was broken for one of our mobile applications. He dropped like 10,000 CVEs for a ton of different applications. And we got that call like Thursday that said, hey, the CVE is going to be posted. You guys better fix your mobile app. But anyway, I would say the same thing could be done in it for a number of different things for Android, obviously. Yeah. But for iOS, outside of that, like mythical new platform that's been kicking around since the beginning of this year that no one's really gotten access to yet, I haven't seen much luck of virtualizing iOS, which obviously, Seth, you know that, but it's a whole different game.
Yeah, I mean, if I go back a few years, right, when I worked on the Syratool stuff and we spoke at Black Hat, that was the whole pie in the sky idea, was that we could automate a lot of that and pull those down and actually do just low-level analysis on the binaries that were in the App Store. But that it due to other reasons, it never happened. But instrumenting anything in iOS is so difficult. Just Apple doesn't give us the same low level access as Android does. So, yeah, I mean, that brings us to another topic, right? I mean, we're talking about mobile assessments. We're talking about looking at mobile applications. Let's talk a little bit about the tool set that you use for actually analyzing a mobile application, right? Both on iOS and Android. Maybe let's start on Android, and then we can talk iOS after that.
Yeah, so I'm a device guy. I like to have physical devices when I'm doing testing, even though Genymotion, the actual Android emulator from Google, they're great. And I think Genymotion even comes rooted, like you don't even have to do a single command. And virtualization or emulation virtualization has come a long way when it comes to Android. But I stick to my physical devices. I have a Nexus 7 rooted. I have a Motorola G4 that I bought specifically because a client said we want untouched, no special tool devices. So I went out and went to Dollar General and picked up the cheapest Android phone I could get. And I got home, and my wife is so cute. She's like, "Is that a burner phone?" And I said, I guess, yeah. I'm not gonna put.
She's been watching a little too much Breaking Bad, right? Or
yeah. But so I have like a test device that's rooted and has all my tools and everything. Then I have a completely control device that has nothing special. The only thing I have done, it is Android 6, so you can still install a CA without rooting it and having the restrictions that the Google now puts in Nougat and above for trusting your own CA. So I do have that. I have a CA installed, and that CA, of course, is then to be able to hook that up through Burp and look at traffic utilizing TLS certificates that I can then mint on the fly and utilize for proxying. But outside of having the physical device, Burp Suite is obviously my go-to. I live in Burp like 8 hours a day. I also use Frida pretty extensively. I use Frida for a bunch of different things. It's a dynamic hooking toolkit if you haven't used Frida before. I use it for pinning bypass. So there's a really good pinning bypass module, both for OK HTTP as well as just SSL context, I think. So I use it for that. Frida I also use for just there's a couple of different hooking mechanisms, and one of them will just sit there and look at different cryptographic operations that are done and just kind of give you hints like, hey, this is what's being done. And then you can hook that, using, different methods and whatnot. And of course, I will SSH into the device or ADB into the device and get into the operating system, look at shared prefs, all that good stuff. But those are kind of my main go-tos when it comes to Android testing. I don't know, Seth or Ken, if you have any thoughts as far as other tools you guys like to use for Android.
Well, I did want to ask you, why the preference for physical devices over virtualization?
Personally, I remember the days where virtualization was slower. There were some issues with some different motherboards and graphics cards and whatnot. It just wasn't a very user-friendly move. Also, as sensors began to evolve, fingerprint sensors and different things, there was just a little bit clunky to use the emulator or virtualization on Android to utilize some of those features. And I've just always kind of gravitated towards using physical devices. And I think it's just, I don't know, it's kind of like the Burp versus Zap argument. There's nothing wrong with Zap. It's not that it doesn't do anything, but the workflow is just so different. And that's kind of my thought as far as physical versus virtual. There's nothing that is fundamentally different as far as Android's concerned. However, it's just my workflow. I just have gotten very comfortable with using physical devices. I've just kind of kept going down that road. Obviously, there's huge advantages, especially what we just talked to, as far as like ephemeral environments and stuff of using virtualization. But
no, I was gonna agree with you. I definitely tend towards physical devices. I mean, I came up through the iOS side, right, where it was basically mandated on me. So I got used to using Burp with a physical device and actually making that work, and not having to deal with Genymotion or VirtualBox, right? Or it doesn't happen to run within the VMware instance that I'm running, or what have you. I just never put the time in to build my workflow out. And so it was easier for me to go buy a device. I know it's going to run on that device. That being said, when I do get code reviews and things like that that are mobile focused, I have found that using like Android Studio with the actual like targeted emulator works pretty well, right? To test it in a different way. But I come at it differently when it is code review than I do when it's a black box test of, hey, pull this down from the App Store and then take a look at it, right? So, you have that. I mean, have you played with Frida inside of the emulators as well? Have you found that that actually works the same way? Or is that part of your workflow, is that the physical device works better with Frida in that situation?
That's a great question. I have not even tried to use Frida in a virtualized Android device. For iOS, it would be interesting. You'd have to use the dynamic library type hooking for Frida. You would not be able to, there isn't really a good virtualization of a jailbroken device where you could have a daemon running on iOS. There is that one, and I apologize. I tried Googling it quickly and I can't find it. There is a announced soon to be launching full virtualization of iOS that's jailbroken and has script installed out of the box. It's supposed to be debuting any day, month, year from now. That I would imagine you would be able to do Frida and whatever hooking you wanted from that. However, unless you use the dynamic library hooking for iOS, and I still don't know how that would work with the emulator in Xcode. But I haven't tried iOS at all. For Android, I've just kind of stuck to my guns with physical device and using Frida in the manner in which I learned how to use it. And I would imagine it would work. I just honestly haven't tried.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about Frida then, right? Yeah. I mean, because you are depending on that heavily, right? So Burp Suite you're using for man-in-the-middle proxy to actually analyze the traffic and see what's going on there. What is it that you're using Frida to do within your workflow? I mean, you don't have to uncover any special sauce, but give us a rundown of what it is that Frida gives you that you don't necessarily have through SSH or something else.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just pulling up the list. So there's actually a code share out there. It's codeshare.frida.re that has a bunch of different JavaScript modules that are built for Frida that can do a bunch of different things. And they have them for iOS as well as Android because Frida can be run on both. Frida can be run on Windows, Mac, iOS, Android, QNX. They have hooks for all the different major platforms and even desktop environments. And from there, you write basically JavaScript modules that will plug in and do different things. So specifically, I use Frida for the big one is TLS pinning bypass. So okay. It's not my only method of doing it, but it's an easy method. So if you have the Frida hook, and the application uses the SSL context. Basically it'll just wait in runtime to see that SSL context call. It'll hook that call, basically kind of like swizzle the method, and basically bypass that to pin to whatever CA you give it. So I would give it my burp CA, and it would just basically say, oh, okay, don't go here to look for the CA. This is the CA you should be pinning to. And then that's pretty much how it works. I've also used, I'm just looking through to make sure I'm not thinking. There's the other one, AES Infos, is the crypto one, where it'll just look for cryptographic operations and dump out any time that cryptographic operations are being done in the application. So you can just use the app, do a pipe to whatever you want, and then go back through and see when the different cryptographic operations were done. If it can analyze it, sometimes it'll actually output the clear text. Sometimes it'll just say, yeah, AES was done here or whatnot. So that's, again, runtime, kind of dynamic runtime output, I guess you'd say, for that one specifically. But you can do hooking, you can do different types of oh, the other big one I'm forgetting is free dump, which is memory dumps. So basically, it's Python that was written as a hook for Frida, and basically you can dump the entire memory of the device. Just like there's some other tools that I'm blanking on at the moment because free dump is my go-to now. So yeah, dumping memory is another big one that I use Frida for.
Okay. Yeah, so you're looking for things on device using to break the SSL, like the pinning, right? And that'll bring us to another topic here shortly, for sure. You're using it to dump the memory to look again for unprotected spaces. I mean, it sounds a lot like the debugger functionality is what you're using Frida for, right? Is to make changes to the binary as it's running locally, so that you can analyze the application as it's running. Is that a correct statement?
That's absolutely correct. It's somewhat similar to script or script, whatever if you want to call it that in the iOS space. I think Drozer used to do, or maybe it's still maintained. I don't no disrespect to the Drozer folks, can do some of this as well with some different hooks. I've just gravitated towards Frida because the nice thing about Frida, it is cross-platform, and it's pretty straightforward to get installed as long as you have the right access. It basically spins up a daemon on the device, iOS or Android, and you can utilize the code share scripts. You can write your own scripts in JavaScript and use it for dynamic hooking at runtime.
Okay. So have you seen a difference? So if we switch over to the iOS side, okay, we've talked to Android, Frida, the stuff that you're using there. I mean, we could talk about exposed and some of the other like rooted device options on Android. I'm sure you've dealt with those, but let's switch over to iOS for a second. If you are using Frida on both of those different platforms, what differences do you see between those two? And how can somebody go about using it in both of those environments?
Yeah, so in iOS, the one thing I don't use is obviously the SSL context pinning bypass, and that's because it doesn't exist in iOS. The go-to gold master, tried and true iOS is the SSL kill switch 2. Now, okay. Obviously you know this, Seth, but for those of you that might be listening, that does basically break TLS across the board for any app that's using TLS if it's toggled to on. So be very careful you're only using that on a test device, because it basically renders TLS moot if you have it turned on for SSL kill switch 2. I kind of use a mix of script as well as Frida for the dynamic hooking, and the reason for that is because folks like yourself, Seth, David Lindner, some of my other iOS friends have written pretty straightforward scripts of obtaining different data from the different method swizzling and from the different hooks from script. So I've kind of just used that a little bit more. I think those could be migrated to Frida and probably limit the need to use both of those tool sets. However, I just haven't taken the time to make those. But there are some other good ones that are specifically for iOS from the code share as well. I'm looking at it over here on the screen. There's like Objective-C class dumpers. There is an iOS SSL bypass, but I haven't tested it, so I can't vouch for it. There's data protection class dumps. There's one that supposedly can try to mask jailbreak, sort of like TS Protect or something else in the iOS space. Again, haven't tried that, so your mileage may vary, or I don't have any mileage, so use it at your will. But yeah, you can see there's a bunch of different stuff. There's one here that's specific for Titanium apps. So if you have a Titanium built iOS app, it's supposed to dump encrypted assets from the Titanium app. So there's a ton of really good stuff from Frida, both on iOS and Android.
Yeah. I mean, I would encourage anybody that's looking at apps in a professional or even semi-professional, like, hey, you're just taking a look at it, to get to know Frida because of the power that it gives you. I mean, it's hooking into the operating system like a debugger does. So it gives you a lot more power than just SSHing into the device, right? I mean, it's very easy to jailbreak a device and then log in as root Alpine. But or, to root a device on the Android side and to get into it. But once you're there, actually having the ability to make changes or to manipulate the application to get it to do what you want it to do, as opposed to what the developers intended, which is the whole point of analyzing an application for security, is very difficult without having those debug hooks into the application. And Apple especially keeps making it more and more difficult to actually do anything, right? It used to be it was iOS 8.1.2, I want to say, when they took away the ability to actually modify files outside of the documents or in the documents and preferences directory, right? And when they did that, it was a huge security win for people that just use the device unjailbroken. But for us in the security community, it was like D-Day, right? It was so oh crap, what am I going to do now? I have to have a jailbroken device to look at any of these apps or to be able to do anything. So along those lines, right? Have you dealt with any, I know there's services that are out there like Now Secure and some of those other vendors that are very mobile focused. Have you dealt with what they do in comparison to, our workflow?
I'm not quite following you, and maybe that's because I don't know the vendor you're speaking to.
Oh, there's a couple of the vendors. Like if you look at Veracode or Now Secure, that you can provide them with an app binary. Oh, yeah. Veracode is fairly, that's static analysis.
Yeah.
Now Secure claims to do more of more of an app assessment style attack or assessment of your application.
Yeah.
But I'm not sure exactly how they're hooking in comparison to what we do from a consulting perspective. So the question is probably moot if you haven't dealt with it before. But there are vendors out there that are mobile specific that you could take a look at if you're just looking for someone to do an assessment, or you can talk to Kevin, right? Hit him up on Twitter. So
yeah, I'm sorry. As soon as I looked at Now Secure, I have seen them, and I was curious of what their secret sauce was, to be honest with you. But one thing I didn't mention, and it plays into the Frida thing, and I remember the last episode that Stefan Edwards and David Corsi were on, you guys threw out the question, FiOS, which is Frida iOS something, S. It's spelled like Verizon FiOS, and I'm waiting for that day to come where hey, we got to change our name. But it's a GUI interface on top of Frida, which stitches a bunch of the different Frida scripts and modules that I just spoke to. So you can dump out memory with a click. You can look at the class dumps with a click. You can look at all the device information. It's actually a really nice, I believe it's Electron-based GUI. And the gentleman who wrote it, he's from Central America somewhere, I believe. He was just like a front-end designer who worked in tandem with a security guy who gave him the idea to write this around the free and open source Frida scripts that were out there. So it actually it has a GUI that's much more polished than any other security tool that I've used in a while. It's not perfect. There are some bugs. Sometimes things take a little while to come through, and it's not a complete replacement for Frida, command line. However, it's a really solid first attempt at what they were able to put together. So that's another one that has snuck its way into my iOS toolbox.
Yeah.
I don't know if Seth you saw on Slack, but David Corsi mentioned that Now Secure uses Frida.
Okay. Oh, he found. Did he find an actual link, or does he have actual proof of that?
Yeah, he could be just trolling, but he said their GitHub has
R2 Frida. See, it's all about OSINT, right? Or what their GitHub actually uses, and that doesn't surprise me, right? They are in the same boat as all the rest of us. So actually, being able to analyze these applications, you've got to be able to run a debugger against them. And if you don't have access to the source code, where do you turn? And that's where the physical device seems to come into play, at least for me. So, like, to go back a little bit on the iOS side, right? So if you've got Frida, have you played much with IDB and IRET, right? Like those other tools that are out there. What's your experience with them? You know, what was it that you liked or you didn't like about them that pushed them out of your workflow?
So IDB, I'll just be the guy who says it. I always have Ruby issues trying to get it to run, and
that's why you have Canon speed dial.
I know.
That's why you have Canon speed dial.
I'm thinking, go to Ken or mutual friend JP. I'm like, why isn't this thing working? It's giving me this crazy Ruby error. So that's honestly why FiOS was like the light that came down. It was like, oh, a replacement for IDB. It doesn't have the hooks for dumping the keychain that IDB had. However, IDB used Nitin Jami's keychain editor behind the scenes anyway. And that's a funny story. I don't know if I said this before to you, but I was on an assessment at a different job, and I'm sitting at a terminal, assessing an iOS app. And there was a gentleman from NCC Group sitting next to me, completely different consulting group working for the same client. And he's working on an iOS app. And I was using Keychain Dumper to look at the keychain contents. And he looks over and he says to me, why aren't you using Keychain Editor? It does what Keychain Dumper does, but it does it better. And you can edit the contents. I said, oh, that's great. Where did you learn about this? And he's like, I wrote it. It was Nitin sitting next to me. And he was like, yeah, here it is. Do it. And it was awesome. And I've used it ever since. Now, I think I tried it on iOS 11 with the Electra jailbreak, and I have had some issues. And I think I even opened up an issue on his GitHub page, but his GitHub page has been vacant for 2 years. He was picked up by Jet, Walmart's e-commerce company, Jet. And I don't know if he's doing a lot of stuff on his own anymore. But anyway, I still use Nitin's tool for in place of IDB's keychain dumper editor facility, which was just what it used on the back end anyway. But anyway, so FiOS has fully replaced IDB for me. I think you might be able to tell me something that it can't do, but there's probably a command line tool that I've substituted out, or a GUI tool via FiOS that I can put in its place. And I'll be honest with you, the other one I'm not familiar with. The other one you mentioned.
You know what's funny is my coworker is Patrick Toomey, who wrote Keychain Dumper, and he'd be the first one to tell you, like, he'd be surprised if anyone was still using it. So
it's always like, to be honest, it was always one of those that you knew was behind the scenes, like Keychain Dumper and then Keychain Edit. And like, if you have SSH access, that's all that IDB or IRET or iOS reverse engineering toolkit or something like that. They're all just using these separate tools, loading them onto SSH and then running them and formatting the output for you, right?
Yep.
So very similar to what your FiOS is doing for Frida, it was trying to gather all these different tools together to run locally. Yep. So like it doesn't necessarily surprise me. And half the time I found out there was path issues with IDB or with IRET, and it would just piss me off. So I'd just go directly to the source because, it's Ruby, it's open source. Or IRET, I think, was even something, it wasn't even Ruby. I think it was just a bunch of shell scripts, to be honest with you, right? Like a TK front end or something like that. And so it was easy to look and see, oh, well, it's dumping it. It just can't parse it properly, or it's looking in the wrong location.
Yeah.
What am I using this for, right? If it doesn't actually help my workflow.
So would you just use, like SSH or whatever, what's the protocol of SSH over USB, and just connect to the device anyway and just use the tools themselves? Because that's what I ended up doing. It wasn't until recently with FiOS where I was like, hey, there's a GUI that kind of makes this a little bit easier. But for the longest time, it was just straight up, Debian packages or command line tools in my SSH environment on my jailbroken device. And that was really it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, that seemed to be the easiest way to handle it, especially as you moved through those jailbreaks, because the support was lagging for those tools that, in such a manner that, half of them didn't work when you'd get a new jailbreak for iOS 11 or iOS 10. Yeah. And so you were stuck if you were looking at an application. And that's always my biggest fear with doing iOS app assessments is, crap, you're going to ask for something that the current version of my tool set doesn't support, whether that's Face ID, that, or you're testing out some like Touch ID like function that like I'm running an old version of iOS and I haven't jailbroken or I haven't upgraded to the latest jailbreak. So there's always this kind of fine line that we're walking as security researchers and security people that, Apple can take away. They can pull the rug out at any given time. Anyway, so like, I don't know if you kind of go through that every time there's a jailbreak and you're like, sweet, I got to upgrade everything right now because I know it works. Otherwise, I may be screwed in 6 months when a new app pops up. Right.
So this isn't a staged thing. I swear this is just how my desk always looks. But so here's my Moto burner phone, as my wife calls it, and here's my my Nexus. So these are my Android devices, but also I have 1, 2, 3, and if my headphones were long enough, I have a iPad that's still in the box that when the iOS 11 jailbreak hit, I went out to Walmart and bought 2 new iPads, one for myself and one for David Lindner, that are on 11 dot whatever before 11.1.2, so they're jailbreakable. And I haven't even done anything with it, but it's there because it's always exactly what you said, Seth. It's just this crazy mad rush to find as many devices that are on the jailbreak as it's crazy. Because it's never, I think maybe a few times in the past 3 years, and I'm sure you remember this, Seth. Was it 9? I think it was the 9 dot series where it made it all the way to the like 9.3 before the jailbreak was found, and we thought there wasn't going to be another jailbreak. Like there was some real thought that once clients upgraded past 8 into 9, that we were just going to have to figure out what to do. And then the levee broke a little bit. The 9.3, it's a Pangu, came out, and then 10 had the Yalu, and then now 11 has Electra. So things have gotten better, but there was a real scare there between 8 and 9 where we just didn't know if there was going to be another one.
Yeah. And I mean, that's still my big fear, is trying to build like a business around actually doing this sort of an assessment when you are so dependent on kind of this gray area of whether or not you're going to be able to get at the devices. We spent a lot of time, in that 9 series, right, talking about, all right, we're at the point that we have to have source code because there's no other way for us to do this. That, Cellebrite and some of the other like forensics tools, if they find any of those jailbreakable vulnerabilities, guess what? They're not going to release them because they want the ability to get into those devices. And if you look at bug bounties for iOS on that level, the cost reflects that, right? Yeah. Those guys are willing to pay millions of dollars for you not to release that vulnerability or that exploit for iOS, whatever, just so they have the ability to use it in the future. And I'm sure they're sitting on a number of those for their future business as well.
I think actually it was either David Lindner or David Corsi in our work Slack who actually just pointed out yesterday that Keen Labs came out and said, hey, 11.3.x, we have a jailbreak. They're not going to release it. They never release it. But just like you said, it's vulnerability hoarding. We were very lucky that Ian Beer from Project Zero released the jailbreak that led to the 11 dot series, and then folks like Coolstar and the person who did Liber iOS or whatever it was called put the work in to get those out. And specifically, I know he's probably not listening, but whoever the developer was for with the screen name of Coolstar put in a ton of work into the Electra jailbreak, and it's extremely solid. They reworked Sarik's Cydia to get that running on it, all of the different Debian tools and apt-get and whatever. So it's a lot of work. And there's, all the people who want to do pirating, all the people who want to do tweaks, all the people who want to do things that the device wasn't really made to do, or break out of Apple's walled garden. Then there's this tiny percentage of folks like you and myself who just want to be able to test applications and just want to be able to run our tools on it and carry a device that's fully patched, up to date, in our pocket, that's not jailbroken, because we want to be secure as well, and have a slew of test devices just for this. So I don't know. It's a really kind of odd place to be in, but I'm very thankful for people who do the work.
Oh yeah, definitely, right. And you look at some of those Luca for the Yalu jailbreak, and those guys always talk about how much crap they get, from the community on, well, why aren't you releasing this? What's the problem? This should just be like easy peasy, but no one's willing to step up and do the work, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a lot like open source projects, but it's, this open source project that you're releasing that people expect support on, even though they're basically killing the security of their device, so that they can, install some random like Hello Kitty theme over the top of iOS, right? I don't think that a lot of people understand what they're doing when they jailbreak those devices from a security perspective, but they have something else that they want to do, whether that's in China, they want to be able to load up an alternate app store with all the, download all the apps for free or whatever, what have you.
Speaking of China, one tool that I haven't really mentioned today, and all the guys in Slack, including yourself, both of you guys who used to be in Slack with me, will know I'm a huge proponent of Surge Proxy. So Surge Proxy is an iOS proxy. It's for macOS as well as iOS. And I think it was actually developed by a Chinese developer to implement rules to route around the Great Firewall. But it's basically a proxy that's written like a firewall. So when you create rules, it actually hooks in and reads like firewall rules. So it'll look at DNS or CIDR range or host name or CIDR range or whatever, and you can basically look at things even that don't obey the system proxy. You can look at things at a lower level utilizing a basically full VPN tunnel that Surge makes on the device, and then applies these firewall-like rules. And the cool thing is when you combine Surge macOS and then connect your iOS device to it and use it as a gateway out, and then you can start to apply proxy rules at the process level or the port or the domain or the CIDR or whatever, and you can get really well ingrained proxy rules then for those over to your proxy du jour, whatever it is that you like to work in, like I like Burp. So, but if you're not using that, it's relatively cheap. I think it's like $60 a seat on macOS. And then it is the most expensive app I've ever bought on iOS, but it's only $50. And it's gotten me years worth of use. So it's actually not a lot in the security world, but it's the most I ever threw down in the iOS app store. But, and I bought 3 seats thinking I could use 1 seat on macOS and 1 seat on iOS. And then they're like, no, they're 2 different licensing models. So I had to spend another $50 or whatever. But it's a really good tool. If you haven't used it, my coworkers say I'm going to have Surge tattooed across my chest, like this Penguins logo, but it's really cool.
Yeah, I mean, I can see how that would be useful. I mean, if we talk about web testing, right, like using, Foxy Proxy or whatever to actually look for regexes and then send specific proxy requests through. That sounds very similar.
Yep. Is that nssurge.com?
Yeah, I think. Let me double. It's that's the. Yes, that's it. nssurge.com. The nice thing for the Mac client as well is if you put it in advanced mode, which is DNS hooking, if you load up the picture of it, you can actually click on the process, like I mentioned, and then just proxy by that process, then apply further rules to it. But like, I don't know if you've ever tried to proxy Electron clients, like all the GitHub stuff, or the Chrome, or your Electron app of the day. the way to proxy Electron apps is to actually pass in command line arguments. That's the best way to do it. But because it doesn't obey the system proxy stuff, I don't believe. So like Slack, for instance. But in Surge, you can just right click on the process and say send to proxy. So it's all done via the Surge interface, which is really nice. So. And then if you...
So you're saying that pairs pretty well then with using something like SSL kill switch, or with the free to, plugins, or the free to, code shares for actually disabling SSL, right?
Yeah, the biggest thing I use Surge for on iOS is just apps that don't obey system proxy. They create their own HTTP server, or they have, things that I don't know if, Seth, you've ever tested antenna applications. Antenna was kind of like a...
Is that like a React Native application or something along those lines? Or
kind of, it's like an early Xamarin or HTML-based cross-platform development, but it uses high ephemeral ports for its traffic. It doesn't, bind it to 443 or what have you. So actually, it doesn't obey the system proxy, and because it uses these random ports, ephemeral high ports, it was very tough to proxy unless you used IP tables and all kinds of different stuff. Where Surge, you would just, whatever the domain was, because it uses a full tunnel VPN to funnel all of the traffic through that, then outbound, it catches everything that comes out of the device. You could actually proxy cellular traffic out of the device to whatever proxy you want.
Cool. Well, yeah, this was the whole reason I wanted to have this discussion with you, because that's one that I haven't played with, but I can see where it's useful already in some of the apps that I've been looking at in the last few months. I can definitely see where that would be useful. So like if we dig into those different styles of apps really quick, right? Like for those people that are listening, like we're talking about, native applications, but what else is there that's available from an app development perspective that you've run into? You've mentioned antenna, but what else do you see on the device that people are using to build these applications?
Yeah, a lot of the apps tend to be so even the cross-platform. So we're talking about the Xamarins, which I've seen a lot of lately. There's Cordova. There's a few other ones which are basically kind of write it once in an HTML JavaScript language. Then it uses the native APIs and hooks that the frameworks expose for the different operating systems. So it has some for iOS, it has some for Android. It may even have some for BlackBerry or Windows Mobile still hanging around there. And then basically you can pick how you want to deploy it. Obviously, if you're deploying your code, cross-compiling it to different, and I'm sorry, let me take one more step back. Something like Xamarin, they have basically several levels of how you can develop. You can develop it more like a native app, and if you develop it more with the native hooks, then it's obviously going to have a faster, cleaner feel, and it's going to expose more APIs. Or you can extrapolate yourself a step further and develop an application that looks extremely similar across the different ecosystems, but then you're going to have less ability to interact with some of those core APIs that those frameworks expose. But I interrupted myself. But I would say Xamarin, Cordova. You mentioned React Native, Antenna. Those are kind of the big ones that I can think of. I don't know, Seth, from a code level, can you think of any ones that you've run into recently?
No, I mean, one of the most interesting one was somebody that actually developed an app that was all, there was a small like shim layer that was native to iOS and Android, but all of the code was C++ libraries, right? On a low level, which was an interesting way to play it as well, right? You forget that the underlying operating system for both iOS and Android is, it's Linux and it's BSD.
Yeah.
So of course you could just develop some shared libraries and then use that as your core functionality. I think that was one that actually, David Lintner was on with me. That was pretty interesting to dig into because of the C. But then it also introduces all of those vulnerabilities that we don't necessarily think about when you're dealing with Swift or with Xamarin or any of those others, like your buffer overflows, your string vulnerabilities, right? All those others come back into play because you're handling things on such a low level.
Yeah, I've been looking into that a little bit. It might be even the same one that you're thinking of, but like kind of lower level C cross platform libraries that hook and can do some interesting things. One thing that I've been doing for my talk coming up at B-Side Knoxville, I've been researching mobile analytics and some of the different information that's sent and received and stored in those analytic layers. And I've also been tailing the syslogs from the iOS console and the Android logcat, and seeing sometimes where even though applications know some things are restricted, they'll still ask the operating system to give them. And you actually see the operating system kind of give them a slap on the wrist and say, no, that's restricted. You can't get that level of detail. But most of the time it's for analytics. It's restriction for the UUID. It's restriction for very specific user privacy things that these analytics layers or the applications themselves to give to the analytics layer are requesting, and they just want more and more detail to be able to tie you throughout all these properties and their properties, and I don't know. It's a crazy web, and I hope to talk some specifics in my talk coming up.
That sounds pretty interesting, because I mean, the fact that those apps are asking for it means that depending on the iOS version or the Android version that you're running, some of those probably give up that information, right? Yep. Those underlying operating systems aren't as refined. So I can see where asking for it doesn't cost them anything. But if they get the data back, then all of a sudden they know, hey, that much more about you, and they can tie it back to whatever, they can link it back on the back end, like everything, and then they can give it to Cambridge Analytica with everything else. Right? Yeah,
that broke after I submitted my CFP. So I'm waiting for people to raise their hands at Knoxville and say, what do you think about Cambridge? Was that your because one thing I did put in, like, is that one social media company listening to your conversations to target ad towards you? But I put that in before the whole Cambridge thing, and I can just imagine how that's just going to make people think that I had some type of inside baseball for the Big F, and I don't. I really don't. But that's another thing I wanted to mention as far as analytics. One tool or trick of the trade that I can tell anyone who does bug bounties, anyone who does mobile application assessments or web application assessments, when Burp Suite gives you that pop-up that says, hey, do you want to hide everything that's outside of your target scope? Don't do that, because you will miss all of the analytics data that's going to Adobe and going to Crashlytics and go into all the other ones that I'm going to shame a little bit in a couple weeks. And that's important because your session data is in there, your GPS logs are in there, your IP addresses, all your stuff that is specific to you, although it's their portion of the cloud analytics, and hopefully they're not leaking that to third parties or selling it. But it's important to see that, and it might win you some bug bounty cash if you can see that they're leaking third. I don't know how. I don't do a lot of bug bounty, so I know our clients care if they leak session data in their analytics. I don't know if bug bounty providers would pay out for that kind of thing, but
yeah, one thing you definitely see is, like, in the refer header, if it comes from, say, something with like a sensitive token in the URL or something like that, and that shows up in the refer. That's why you also, to add to what you're saying, you keep all that information so you can analyze it later. Don't not collect it.
Exactly.
Bad idea.
I mean,
you still collect it, right? But it's hidden from your view.
Yeah.
I would totally agree with that, right? The first time it popped up, I'm like, oh, it'll keep like my proxy log very like clean and neat, and all I see is, what I want to see. And then you start looking at the target and everything else that you're missing, and I was like, oh, hold on a second, right? if I don't see everything, I don't know what my device is doing and what is coming from the app versus what is coming from the OS and what you'll typically see. So it's very easy to miss things.
And one thing that's really important for mobile that I saw a lot of, it's getting better as of late with the switch to HTTPS everywhere. But for a while, all of the app traffic would be HTTPS, or hopefully all of the app traffic would be HTTPS. But then the marketing and analytics would go over HTTP. And it had all that bad PII, whatever you want to put in there. I've seen socials in there. You name it, I've seen it in analytics. And that was going up to Adobe's Marketing Cloud or Crashlytics or Google's whatever. And that was going over plain text HTTP. And in the mobile space, that is extremely concerning because our mobile devices are just connecting to whatever Wi-Fi's they can find or not. And, SS7 and all the different concerns that are out there. I mean, it's compoundly bad when we're talking about a device that isn't a laptop could do the same things, I guess, but it's pretty concerning from mobile application space. So, yeah.
Cool. Let's see. Ken, you have any questions? I've been peppering him with mobile stuff. And
no, I'm just absorbing, and you two know a lot more about mobile, so it's nice to listen. Don't really have too many questions.
One thing that I wanted to bring up, I'll keep it under a few minutes here, but we talked about TLS pinning, and we talked about using Frida. As well as SSL kill switch 2. One thing that I've been doing as of late is pulling down the IPA, pulling down the APK, utilizing APK tool or utilizing Clutch to dump an unencrypted IPA, or just unpackage the IPA and look at the raw resources and finding where the pinning is actually at in the code, whether it's in the smally and I can just flip in my own hash for the pin, or whether it's just a lot of times in iOS land, it's just a P12 file or whatever, not P12, but whatever cert, and it's just stapled right in the payload of the archive of the IPA. It's not encrypted, it's not obfuscated at all. And if you just swap in your own cert, either you point to a hash of your cert from the OK HTTP library in Android, or the SSL context pinning or network manifest file in Android, or in iOS, you just sub in the actual cert, then rebuild the app, or use Impactor to reload the app on iOS. A lot of times you can just literally sub in whatever cert you want to pin to, or just remove the code that's doing or swizzle the Boolean value of whether it's checking for the cert pinning or not. And I've had more luck with that as of recently than using like dynamic hooking or SSL kill switch or something like that to just bypass it altogether. I just basically pin to my own burp CA, and that has been really effective as of late for bypassing. And several episodes ago, Seth spoke to both TLS pinning as well as signatures being kind of the bane of pen testers' existence when it comes to gray box or white box testing, like Seth and I spend most of our time doing. And having a feature toggle, having a test build, having something that you could provide if you really want your pen testers to spend time looking at your app and not defeating your front door security is vital. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and most people that are paying you to do that will be willing to provide some sort of staging build. But at times, especially if you're looking bug bounty wise at mobile apps, like I feel like I never know what's going to work with an app. Right? There's all the different methods that you mentioned to actually go about doing that. Whether it's, hey, I found the cert in the IPA, now I have to repackage it and push it back up with Cydia Impactor, or it's, hey, for this instance, it worked well on Android using, whatever exposed library there to actually do the SSL, depinning or, SSL kill switch. Yeah. I mean, again, it's one of those things that, you try X. If it doesn't work, then you move on to something else. And eventually you find a way to get around it. But that may not always be the case.
Yeah.
It may take more effort than you necessarily want to be put into it. So asking for that unpinned version probably will only take the developer 2 seconds to build you your own instance, and it will save you hours of time in the long run.
One quick story to go along with that. I was at B-Sides Orlando a couple weeks ago, and there was a couple gentlemen from Akamai who spoke to, I don't know if you may have seen it on Krebs or in the news. There was a pretty big Android C2 botnet that was utilized for DDoS against a number of different properties out there. And the gentlemen from Akamai were the ones who found it and identified it and vanquished it. But they did an awesome presentation. They worked actually with the Googles and with the Amazon and with a couple other big players to look at the traffic, understand the traffic. There was some different things, and I don't want to take away from their presentation. It was awesome. But at the end of it, they actually showed the Smalley code, and they showed the different methods that they were using and some different obfuscation layers they did. And then the gentleman actually put in pseudocode into a slide. Like, this is the actual code in the Android apps, and this is what it was doing. And I raised my hand at the end and I said, this is fantastic. I can't believe you guys found all this. Is awesome. But I have one question. Why didn't you use APK tool and then use Dex to jar and then JD GUI or something like that to actually look at the pretty close to decompiled Java? And the guy kind of looked puzzled, and he looked over at his cohort, and he's like, I didn't know that existed. And he literally they did all this awesome work from Smalley code, right? I was like, man, I really wish, like, they probably could have done this in a fraction of the time. And then he looked at me and he said, well, why isn't that just built into APK tool? That would only make sense. And I was like, you're right. That should be, it should just be one-stop shop. So it was just funny. There are so many mobile tools out there. There are so many ways of skinning the cat. And you have to be agile. You have to keep up with all the different repos that are out there and know the different OS limitations and the different API levels in Android and the restriction. Android is getting awesome with their restrictions. I briefly mentioned on it earlier, but starting with N, you can't install a CA. You cannot install a CA that's trusted for applications or Chrome unless you have like MDM level corporate push, which I would love to create a tool that uses that functionality if that's possible, but that's on my back burner. But you have to get root level on the device. You have to then toggle the OS. You have to mount the OS into write mode. You have to write to the system. I have a blog out there on Invisium's blog about exactly what you need to do and how to do it. But if you don't have root access to your device in Android 7 or above, you can't add a trusted cert CA for Burp to listen to. You just can't do it. And I know our friend Jerry Gamblin pinged me a few weeks ago, probably longer than that now, and he said, hey, I'm looking at this Samsung S8, but I can't figure out how to install the CA on it. And the Samsungs, you can't root. You couldn't do it. And he's like, okay, I'm going to go get a Pixel then. Yep. It's like, yeah, I would too.
Yeah, it always feels kind of like a race, right? How long are we going to be able to use these tools and actually have an updated OS that we can use them with on both sides? Granted, on the iOS side, or on the Android side, it seems a lot easier just because there is the Pixel that's out there. There are the developer editions of the phones that we can get a hold of to run and get access to. And Google has made that easier. To their credit, right? It's because they want developers to actually build tools on there, be able to troubleshoot and see what's going on. Yeah. Whereas on iOS, they're like, oh, just use the simulator, even though it's completely a different platform when it really comes down to it.
Exactly.
Are there any projects, like there's the whole like awesome AppSec resources list on GitHub. Is there anything like that for mobile that I can point people towards?
That's a great question. I probably have some bookmarked. I'll have to see which ones I have. I know there are some. I can't think of any off the top of my head though. I'm searching my bookmarks now.
Yeah.
No worries. I just thought it'd be nice, and if not, we can always tweet it out or something. Maybe put it in the description.
I mean, you Google Android security, awesome. There's an Android security resource. There's online analyzers, but like of the 20 analyzers, 12 are crossed out because they no longer work, right?
Yeah, it seems much harder to keep up with than web testing.
Well, here, let's post that one out there because it's pretty interesting because it does, call out Drozer and Exposed and some of those other tools that we've mentioned that we didn't really dig into.
There's also one that's there's a Frida list that just shows all the different tools that came from Frida and uses Frida hooks under the covers. So there is the FiOS one that I've obviously mentioned a few times, but there's other ones out there that are also built on top of Frida that do some different things as well. So I'm trying to find the link for that, but if I can't find it now, I'll definitely follow up with it and send it.
Yeah.
So I listed the Android Security Awesome one. What's this new 6 files? Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
And actually, that looks like a pretty good list. There's some things in there that I'd want to play with as well. Small static code analysis, right? Quark, we didn't even talk about that, right? That's from LinkedIn. So there's all sorts of things that you can play with to analyze applications, but like
Quark
skinning that cat gets difficult. Yeah.
Quark has to use some type of is it just all static or does it use some type of virtualization?
I thought it was doing some sort of virtualization, but I could be wrong. It's been so long since I've played with it because it is scanning from a different perspective, right?
Do you have a link for that?
For Quark?
Yeah.
Quark, however you want to say it. Yeah, here, we can post that one out too. Yeah, so we've talked about a whole bunch of tools. We're going to have to list those on the site itself or within the episode. We'll copy and do that.
Well, actually, as it turns out, what YouTube does now is on that live chat, it actually keeps the video. So next to the video, it keeps the chat at the time that it had been pasted during
cool
video. So like basically, if you go to if you want any of these links, you just go to the very end of the video. The live chat will be there, and you can grab it.
Nice.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Yeah, that is nice.
That is handy then, I guess. They aren't just throwing it away like we thought.
No, they were, and
it's a new feature. Cool.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yeah. Well, so Kevin, right? We've talked a lot about mobile stuff. We really got into the weeds, which is awesome. Is there anything else? I mean, we've been going for an hour and 15. Obviously, you and I and Ken could talk about this for hours, but to kind of like put a summary on it or anything else that you want to talk about before we call it tonight.
Trying to think here. No, I think we've really
actually, yeah.
Please.
No. Like we've talked about all this. We dug into the weeds, but maybe if we like crawl back a little bit, somebody that wants to get into mobile app assessment work, where would you suggest that they go? Where would they start?
So you've mentioned this a few times, both of you, Ken and Seth, you both mentioned this a few times. We live in a new era where, in the past 3 years or whatnot, where these companies have just opened bug bounties and they have applications. So I've mentioned it at least once in this podcast, but Jet has an open bug bounty. And one of their properties that they allow you to test against is the Jet.com or the Jet Android and iOS app. One of the things that Jet does is they happen to pin certificates. One of the things that I've mentioned in several different ways is how to bypass that. So if you are trying to understand that, you want your first hurdle, there's an app that they don't mind if you test against. Obviously read the rules and scope in the HackerOne or bug crowd rules of engagement or scope, but that would be an awesome place. Look at real apps that are out there. Go out and middle. I do this all the time. I don't want to advocate for it, but I have like 100 apps on my phone that I use daily, or that I have installed, and some of them I do use daily. And I like to look and middle them and see what they're doing and see how much of my information it's throwing out there or whatnot. As long as you're not modifying, tampering, sending that, you're doing rogue stuff, there's nothing wrong with looking at the traffic that's going on your device, or getting a test device and passively looking at traffic. So those would be places that I would start. I would look at bug bounties. You can look at real apps. You can see the kind of protections that are in place. I would, go out there, and there are older apps like Jack's Droid Goat, or there's an iOS version of that. But specifically, I would look at real world apps and look at the different real applications that are out there, or go out to GitHub and look at code. There's, probably hundreds of thousands of applications out there in both iOS and Android that have open source code out there that you can look at and familiarize yourself with it. Get used to Android Studio, get used to Xcode, pull stuff down, build apps, look at the error messages, look at the debugging, consoles, play around with the emulators. And I know you guys mentioned this a lot in the podcast you had with Charles, but we just live in this information where there's just so much knowledge and just a wealth of information that getting started isn't a matter of finding a $400 textbook that is this level of entry that's impossible for most people, or improbable for most people. There's just so much free information out there.
Cool. No, yeah, that's a great recommendation. Is just, hey, try and man in the middle of some of this traffic, pull down Xcode, start somewhere with an app that you use all the time, figure out how it's talking to the back end. And then jump into the bug bounties, right? If that's the direction that you want to go. But at the very least, you should know what Facebook is doing with your data, right? Or Twitter or whatever else. Because if you understand that, or if you could peel back those layers, then most likely you can peel back any of the other layers that exist around those apps.
And also, there's tons of free or next to nothing, via the different training aggregators out there to learn Kotlin, to learn Java, to learn Android Java, to learn Swift, to learn Objective-C. Apple has a ton of classes. I've actually gone through and learned, taken the Swift 3, I think, is the latest one they have, even though Swift 4 is now out.
Yeah.
But do they have a Swift 4 class?
I don't think the class is out. I mean, I think they've got some resources, but the class.
Okay. Yeah. So the class is for 3, but it's like a whole community college class that's Apple education. Like, they developed it themselves, self-paced. It's awesome. All the way down to, of course, they have their Swift playgrounds. So you can start there and go all the way up to infinity, is how complicated or how in depth you want to go as far as learning. But the same things exist out there for Kotlin. The same things exist out there for Java, for Android. And there's just tons and tons of free or next to nothing resources for actually learning how to develop. And obviously, you guys are both developers first and security folks, or have gotten into security from being developers. So I'm sure you would certainly suggest that, as far as if you're wanting to get started in mobile and understanding mobile, would be learn how to develop for it.
Yeah. If you understand how it's built, it's a lot easier to find the flaws, realistically. Cool. Ken, any last minute thoughts? Or Kevin, you too. But
no,
Ken?
I think I would just ask Kevin. Hey, I know, because looking at your Twitter, you're definitely speaking at excuse me, at B-Sides PGH, I think.
Yep.
And is there anywhere else you wanted to mention? Any places you're traveling to speak that you wanted to mention to folks?
So I completely front loaded this year. The only thing I have for the second half, or that I want to put in a CFP for the second half, is Derby. All my other stuff is first half of the year, and it's really crammed to these next couple of months. So I don't want to sound silly, but I have ISAC Phoenix next week.
Cool.
Then I go directly into B-Sides Knoxville the next day, which is a week from Friday. Then B-Sides Pittsburgh. I have a CFP out for B-Sides Cleveland, which is right around the corner. So hopefully that'll come to fruition. B-Sides Orlando was just a few weeks ago, so that was another one. So I've done a lot. I have a lot in this very tight span here. But yeah, so if you're in the Phoenix area, if you're in the Knoxville area, if you're in the Pittsburgh area, of course, you probably already know me. And then Cleveland, hopefully here, if I get selected. But yeah, a lot going on here in the next couple months.
Well, that just means your talk. Well, if it's the same talk, then it just means your talk is going to be really, really good and really tight and really polished.
Not a single one that I've mentioned is the same talk.
Are you serious? Wow. Why would you do that to yourself? No, that's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. Every CFP I do, I'm like, what's something different? I don't want to give the same thing. You know, my Orlando was the same talk from Code Mash. So that one was, and of course, Code Mash is in Sandusky. Orlando's in Orlando, so that's a very different regional thing. I don't think there was a single person who would have been a crossover, but especially from Cleveland to Sandusky, there's probably going to be a lot of people who were at both. Cleveland to Pittsburgh, I'm very cognizant that there's a lot of people who will leave B-Sides Pittsburgh and drive the hour and a half and go to Cleveland the next day or the next week. So I try not to submit to both of those for the same talk. And then B-Side Knoxville, I decided to do the whole mobile analytics thing. So that was a new, yeah, it's kind of snowballed.
You know, thinking about it, I would have done the same thing when it comes to the regional thing, just for that reason that it's not the same. Because you don't want to, yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, so the one for Pittsburgh, which was just announced today, I'm going to be talking about testing REST through Postman and Insomnia and Swagger. And really talking about the basics of REST and the different tooling around that. So that should be a fun one.
Cool. Yeah, that's a good topic, right? Even if it's pretty closely in with mobile stuff and testing those back-end web services. I saw that on Twitter and I was like, oh man, you should post all that, right? I'm going to have to watch that because I do use like Postman, and I've done that before. So that'd be cool.
And Postman's Electron. And if you don't know how to, you know, it's documented, but you have to pass the command line arguments when you run Electron to be able to middle that traffic. So just like even little things like that, or of course there is the configuration for proxies in Postman. But if you don't do that, right, there's some little things about each one of those tools that knowing how to chain things, knowing how they are written, or knowing how to use them effectively will just make your job easier. There's also ways of parsing Postman or Swagger docs within Burp so that you can just use the XML or the JSON documentation from those tools, parse them in extensions in Burp, then just use Burp to send those out and basically bypass those other tools. There's all kinds of different fun stuff that I'll talk about here in Pittsburgh.
Cool. Yeah.
So Phoenix next week, huh?
Phoenix, yeah, it's crazy. I go to Phoenix. I leave directly after Phoenix and fly to Atlanta. Atlanta, drive to Knoxville because there was no way to get from Phoenix to Knoxville in any short amount of time. But yeah, Phoenix on Thursday, Knoxville on Friday. But,
are you still doing the keto diet?
I'm trying. I've been a little more lax.
Well, I want to put in a link here to Chompy's breakfast menu. It's a lot of, if you're in Phoenix and you want a good breakfast, hey, head over there.
Awesome.
Yep.
Cool. Hey, one thing I know we're trying to wrap up. One thing that I wanted to dovetail, and I haven't caught last week's podcast yet because I haven't driven anywhere. But I like to listen to you guys in the car. But the previous week with Charles, I think it was Charles, right?
No, that was Karthik.
No, I'm sorry. The previous week to that.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
2 weeks ago was Karthik, or was Charles. Yeah, you're right. Yep.
So one thing that you guys hit on that I just wanted to mention briefly was diversity. And I know I'm a white guy talking about diversity, which is not necessarily what everyone wants to hear. But the one thing that I've been listening to other podcasts and been listening to other talks about diversity. And the one thing that I really liked was, and I don't remember exactly where it came from, but someone was speaking to diversity, and they were saying how not only just the fact that we need to be more inclusive, we need to have females, and we need to have people from all walks of life for just the normal decency thing, and just to be better people and be more well-rounded. The fact is that the more inclusive your environment is, the more different perspectives you have from different walks of life and different backgrounds, and the faster problems can get solved. And so even though you have these Silicon Valley companies who have a lot of guys who look like me and have educations from the Ivy League backgrounds and are much smarter than I am, the fact of the matter is problems get solved faster when you have people from different walks of life and people who have different backgrounds and have a different perspective for problem solving. So I know that you can talk the talk, and at the end of the day, we all need to walk the walk. But I am a big proponent of leveraging people's backgrounds, leveraging different understandings and perspectives and things. And I think that once we can be more diverse, once we have better coverage of every walk of life in our day-to-day environments, that problems will get solved faster, and we'll see things that never really even bubbled up to the surface for the normal day-to-day, just because we didn't have the right people looking at the right direction for the problem. So
yeah, I mean, if you get all the same people, or if you have all the same people with the same thought process, it's just a bunch of people nodding in agreement to one another.
Yeah. Right.
So it's nice to have some alternative views on things, and which is also, it also brings up a whole other topic, I guess, which is like how to have a rational conversation and use critical thinking, but that's a whole other thing. So both equally important.
Well, maybe that we can talk through that the next time Kevin comes on, so.
I'm from the sticks, from the middle of the woods, didn't even really have a computer until later on in life. My father never touched a computer until the mid 2000s. We had a computer at school, obviously, and at home. Literally, I walked almost a mile to the bus, and my whole graduating class was 100 people. So I'm certainly not, and I didn't go to a fancy college anywhere. I went to a tech school, and then ended up getting, finishing my 4-year degree, via some online schooling. But so I certainly probably don't fit necessarily that mold. But at the end of the day, I certainly haven't faced problems that other folks have faced, whether that be gender or skin color or, different biases out there. So I think not only do you have to consider those things, as well as backgrounds and barriers to entry and all of those things all come into play into, helping us be more well-rounded and come at things from different angles. So again, I hate to be that guy who's talking about diversity when I haven't faced a lot of the problems that are out there. But I think throwing it out there and letting people know that everyone should be willing and open to talking about this, and understanding that it takes a village to do all of this and to solve the problems that we need to solve. We can't, like Ken mentioned, we can't come at this from an echo chamber, and I'm 100% supportive of that.
Yeah, at the same time, I know, because I've had that feeling before about I'm not really probably the right person. But I think the thing is for at least what I've heard from others' opinions is that we are at least part of the part. I mean, there's various roles that everybody plays in improving this community, but we are the right people in a sense, or at least one of the right types of people, just because if we're not promoting diversity and excuse me, inclusion, it's that much harder for others that are trying to be a part of the community. It's like an uphill battle. So yeah, it's something we keep trying to bring up and keep trying to work on, and hopefully this makes it somewhat, even having this conversation makes it somewhat easier for someone out there to be, because it is, here's the thing, tech in general is tough regardless of your background or who you are. It just is, like, you know, so there, and then there's that added difficulty of, like, you know, maybe feeling like you don't belong or something along those lines.
Yeah.
So
at the end of the day, I have, I mentioned him a few times in this podcast, but David Lindner was someone who helped me get into mobile and understand mobile a little bit. I've had other people who've helped me along the way. If there's anyone out there who wants to reach out to me with questions about mobile, whether it's Twitter, whether it's my OWASP email, whether it's whatever, you know, feel free, as long as you're not asking me to hack into your significant other's Facebook account or do anything illicit or illegal. I will be happy to send you pages and pages and pages of GitHub repos or free stuff, or if you really need it, I'll send you some no starch credit and you can go get no starch books, or I'll give you access to Pen Test Academy and you can get that, like whatever you need. If you're having a tough time trying to figure out a niche and a way to get in, my DMs are open. However I can say that. You know, I'm certainly not elite hacker awesome, but if I can help anyone out, I'm definitely here.
You're elite hacker awesome to me, man.
Well, I appreciate that.
Cool. All right. Well, yeah, Kevin, thanks again for coming on and for talking through it, right? You know, both the mobile side and, you know, talking diversity too. It's super important, and, you know, supporting others in the community that are coming up, whoever they may be, and I feel like is the way that it should be. So, but yeah, any last thoughts before we call it for tonight?
Thank you very much for having me again. I really appreciate it. As soon as the last one wrapped, I sent you guys both a message like, hey, anytime you need someone to fill in, even if it's not like Kevin's going to be on in XYZ weeks, it's like, oh, hey, someone couldn't make it. Can you jump on tonight? You know, I was very excited, and tonight certainly lived up to the same level of excitement. Maybe a little bit technical at points. Hopefully we didn't lose anyone, but thank you very much for having me.
Yeah.
No, thanks. And stay on when we end the podcast.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thanks, Kevin, for giving everyone a bunch of insight. So we appreciate it. Next week will be Seth. That's just, I think, you and I next week.
Yep.
Yeah.
We'll announce the topic. We're still discussing a couple of things that we want to talk through, but yeah, join us next week, same time.
There's so many things we could talk about, so we're trying to figure out like what to talk about. I think some of the upcoming guests we've discussed in the pipeline, Chris Gates, Carnal Ownage on Twitter, Alex Smolin. So we're working through this guest list for May, and we should have some speakers and dates lined up. Cool. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
All right. Bye.